The human mind is built to find patterns. We look for safety in routine. But what happens to the collective mind of a society when the routine is replaced by an apocalypse that never seems to end? Welcome to the London Gritty Chronicles. Today, we are not just looking at a disease. We are looking at the scar it left on the human soul. We are exploring the long shadow of the Middle Ages, the psychological trauma, the grief, and the survival guilt that rewired European culture. Listen to the rhythm of the narration. Notice the vocabulary of emotion. Let us turn back the clock. The year is 1347. The setting is the bustling, noisy port of Messina on the island of Sicily. Imagine the sound of a medieval harbor. It is not quiet. It is a symphony of commerce. You hear the creaking of wood, the shouting of merchants haggling over spice prices, the slap of water against the stone docks. It is a scene of life. The horizon is clear, and then sails appear. 12 galleys, ships powered by oars, drift toward the harbor. They fly the flag of Genoa. Usually this is good news. Ships mean trade. Trade means money. But as the ships glide closer, the shouting on the docks fades. Something is wrong. The rowers are not keeping time. The ships are drifting listlessly, awkwardly. When the dock workers throw the ropes to catch the vessels, no one catches them. The silence that falls over Messina in that moment is the first symptom of a trauma that will last for 300 years. When the Sicilian authorities board the ships, they do not find eager merchants. They find a floating graveyard. Most of the sailors are dead. The few who are still alive are barely human. They are covered in black swellings, buboes, oozing blood and pus. Their skin is dark with gangrene. They are delirious with pain. The accidental twist here is that the people of Messina did exactly what any of us would do. They tried to help. Then, realizing the danger, they tried to expel the ships. They ordered the galleys back out to sea. But it was too late. The rats had already scrambled down the ropes. The fleas had already jumped to the dock workers. The invisible cargo had been unloaded. This moment creates what psychologists call a shattering of the assumption of safety. In English, when we talk about a shock to the mind, we often use the word trauma. Trauma, noun. A deeply distressing or disturbing experience that impacts emotional ability. The people of Messina experienced immediate collective trauma. They didn't just fear death, they feared the nature of the death. It was ugly, swift, and seemingly random. Historians tell us that within days, the panic spread faster than the infection. Michael Platiensis, a chronicler who lived through this, wrote, "People hated each other so much that if a son was attacked by the disease, his father would not tend him." Pause on that image. A father refusing to help his son. This breaks the fundamental contract of human biology. Parents protect children. When a disease forces you to break that biological law, the result is deep psychological damage. This is the birth of survival guilt. Survival guilt, noun phrase. The feeling of guilt for staying alive when others have died. Why did the survivors feel guilty? Because to survive, they often had to abandon their loved ones. They had to lock their doors. They had to stop being human to stay alive. The shadow was moving north. It traveled through Italy, through France, and inevitably toward the grey, misty shores of England. Let's look at the biology mirroring society. Inside the body, the bacterium Yersinia pestis attacks the lymph nodes. It disables the immune system, causing the body to attack itself. Outside, in the streets of London or Florence, the exact same thing happened to the social body. The institutions that were supposed to protect people, the church, the government, the doctors, were disabled. They couldn't stop it. So, society began to attack itself. Neighbors accused neighbors. Strangers were beaten. The immune system of the community collapsed. By 1348, the plague arrived in Weymouth, on the south coast of England. It was a wet, rainy summer, perfect conditions for fleas. Now, imagine you are an English peasant. You cannot read, you cannot write. You have never traveled more than 10 miles from your village. Your entire understanding of the world is based on stability. The seasons change, the king rules, and God protects. Suddenly, a rumor arrives from the coast. A great mortality. Notice the word rumor. Rumor, noun. A currently circulating story or report of uncertain or doubtful truth. In the Middle Ages, rumors were the only news source, and in 1348, the rumors were apocalyptic. They said it rained frogs. They said fire fell from the sky. The psychological stress began before the disease arrived. This is called anticipatory anxiety. The fear was almost physical. When the death finally struck London, it wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. In a normal year, a medieval city was accustomed to death. Children died young. Accidents happened. But this was different. The speed was terrifying. A man could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. The psychological impact of this speed cannot be overstated. There was no time to say goodbye, no time for the last rites, no time to make peace. For the medieval mind, dying without confession meant your soul might be lost forever. So, the trauma wasn't just about losing your life, it was about losing your eternity. This created a specific type of cultural grief, a hysterical, desperate grief. We see this in the frantic letters sent between bishops. They were overwhelmed. They granted permission for people to confess their sins to anyone, even to a woman, which was unheard of in the church hierarchy of the time. This shows how desperate the situation was. The rules of society were melting away. As we move through this series, we will use a specific set of vocabulary to analyze these feelings. Here is a phrase you will hear often. The fragility of life. Fragility, noun. The quality of being easily broken or damaged. Before 1348, life was hard, but it felt solid. After 1348, life felt fragile, like glass. The London streets, usually filled with the smell of roasting meat and animal dung, now smelled of vinegar and rosewater. People carried posies of flowers against their noses, believing bad air caused the sickness. But the flowers did nothing. The carts rolled through the city at night. "Bring out your dead!" It is a cliché now, a line in movies. But stripped of the humor, it is the sound of a society functioning on autopilot. The sheer volume of death meant that traditional funeral rites were abandoned. Bodies were piled in trenches, layer upon layer, like lasagna, as one Italian chronicler grimly described it. Think about the survivors standing at the edge of those trenches. They are watching their mothers, brothers, and children being thrown into the mud without a prayer. They are silent. They are in shock. This silence is where the long shadow begins. When the plague finally receded for the first time, the silence didn't end. The birds sang, the sun shone, but the people who walked out of their homes were different. They were shell-shocked, a term usually reserved for war, but perfectly applicable here. They looked at the empty houses next door. They looked at the empty fields. And a question formed in the collective mind of Europe, a dangerous, haunting question. If God is good, why did this happen? And if God is angry, what did we do? This question would drive the art, the violence, and the psychology of the next century. It would turn the survivor's guilt into a search for a scapegoat. If you cannot fight the bacteria you cannot see, you fight the neighbor you can see. The trauma was about to turn outward. The silence of the grave did not last long. It was soon broken by a new sound, a rhythmic, wet thud, the sound of leather hitting flesh. Imagine standing in a village square in 1349. The plague has just passed, leaving half the houses empty. You hear chanting, low, mournful, and terrifying. A procession enters the gates. These are not priests in gold robes. These are men, stripped to the waist, walking in a long, snake-like line. They carry heavy scourges, whips made of leather cords knotted with iron spikes. At a signal from their leader, they swing the whips over their shoulders. Thud. They strike their own backs. Blood flows down their skin, soaking into the waistbands of their linen trousers. They do not cry out in pain. They cry out in prayer. These are the flagellants, the brotherhood of the cross. To the modern eye, this looks like madness. But we must look at this through the lens of trauma. This was a desperate attempt to regain control. The logic was terrifyingly simple. The survivors believed the plague was an arrow shot by an angry God. The cause was human sin. Therefore, to stop the plague, you had to punish the sin. You had to pay the price in blood before the disease took it from you. This is the psychological concept of bargaining. Bargaining, noun. Negotiating terms, often with a higher power, to avoid a bad outcome. It is one of the classic stages of grief. I will suffer this pain, so please, do not give me that pain. The flagellants were a moving theater of trauma. They marched from town to town, performing their ritual twice a day for 33 days, one day for each year of Christ's life. Crowds gathered to watch. And here is the strange part. The crowds didn't run away. They dipped cloths in the flowing blood of the flagellants. They treated it like holy relic. The fear in the population was so high that they latched onto anything that looked like a solution. This brings us to a useful English phrase. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Meaning, in extreme situations, actions that are normally unacceptable become necessary. Society was mirroring the biology of the sick body. When a body is infected, it develops a fever. It heats up to kill the invader. Europe was experiencing a social fever. The heat was rising. The religious intensity was burning up reason. But the flagellants were not just hurting themselves. The energy of a traumatized crowd is volatile. It can shift in a second. This social fever needed a target. If beating yourself didn't stop the dying, the mob looked for someone else to blame. They looked for the poisoners. In the terrified logic of the medieval mind, a disaster this big could not be natural. Someone must be causing it. Someone must be poisoning the wells. This is where the trauma turned into a weapon. In cities across Europe, particularly in the Rhineland and parts of Spain, the grief transformed into rage. The targets were the Jewish communities. This is the darkest chapter of the trauma. It is the phenomenon of the scapegoat. Scapegoat, noun. A person or group who is unfairly blamed for the problems of others. The logic of the scapegoat is a defense mechanism. If I can blame you, I don't have to fear the random chaos of nature. It gives me a false sense of control. If we just remove these people, the sickness will stop. Thousands were murdered. Entire communities were wiped out, often burned alive. It is important to note that the Pope at the time, Clement VI, actually tried to stop this. He issued bulls, official orders, saying the Jews were not responsible, pointing out that Jews were dying of the plague just like Christians. But the Pope was far away in Avignon. The fear was right here, on the street. The mob didn't listen to the Pope. They listened to their own panic. This teaches us a frightening lesson about collective trauma. Fear is often stronger than authority. In England, the violence was less organized against minorities, but the aggression seeped into daily life. The crime rates skyrocketed. Court records from the 1350s show a surge in interpersonal violence. Men stabbed each other over small debts. Women fought in the streets. Why? Because the value of life had crashed. If you have seen half your village die in a week, the threat of being hanged for murder seems less scary. The law had lost its teeth. This is called moral nihilism. Nihilism, noun. The rejection of all religious and moral principles, the belief that life is meaningless. The survivors were living in a post-apocalyptic world. They were suffering from what we might now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Symptoms of PTSD include hyperarousal, always being on edge, and emotional numbing. We see this numbing in the Chronicles. A monk in Ireland, John Glynn, wrote his account of the plague. He listed the dead. He described the horror. And then, at the end of his book, he left blank parchment. He wrote, "I leave parchment for the work to be continued, in case any man of the race of Adam should be able to survive." He didn't expect anyone to read it. He was writing a message in a bottle, throwing it into a dark ocean. But humanity is resilient. The race of Adam did survive. And as the years passed, the acute panic began to fade. The flagellants were eventually banned. The pogroms ceased. The immediate screaming stopped. But the trauma didn't leave. It just changed shape. It went underground. It moved from the streets into the imagination. If you cannot beat death, and you cannot bargain with death, you have to learn to live with death. You have to invite death to the dinner table. In the decades following the Great Mortality, a new kind of art began to appear on the walls of churches and cemeteries. It wasn't about angels. It wasn't about glory. It was about skeletons. Dancing skeletons. The survivors were about to create one of the most haunting cultural memories in history. The Danse Macabre. The Dance of Death. Imagine walking into a stone church in Paris, or London, or Lübeck in the year 1400. The air is cold. The smell of incense hangs heavy. You look up at the wall, expecting to see saints with golden halos. Instead, you see a line of dancers. But this is not a wedding. On the plaster wall, painted in stark black and white, is a long procession. At the front is a pope wearing his heavy triple crown. Next to him is an emperor holding a sword, then a wealthy merchant, then a poor peasant. And between each of them, holding their hands, is a corpse, a grinning, animated skeleton. The skeleton mimics the living. It wears the Pope's hat askew. It tugs at the Emperor's cloak. It seems to be laughing. This is the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. It became the visual soundtrack of the post-plague world. To the modern eye, it looks nightmarish. But to the survivor of the Black Death, it was something else. It was a form of therapy. Psychologists call this exposure therapy. Exposure, noun. The act of subjecting someone to a situation or object. By painting death on the walls, by making it a character in a play, the survivors were exposing themselves to their worst fear. They were looking the monster in the eye until it stopped being a monster and just became a fact. Notice the emotion here. It is not just fear. It is irony. The skeletons are smiling. They are mocking the humans. They are saying, "You worry about your money. You worry about your crown. It doesn't matter. You will dance with me in the end." This art taught a powerful English concept. The Great Leveler. Leveler, noun. Something that removes differences between people, making them equal. Before the plague, the medieval world was a strict hierarchy. The king was near God, the peasant was near the dirt. They were different species. But the plague didn't care about the hierarchy. It killed the Archbishop of Canterbury just as quickly as it killed the stable boy. It killed the King of Castile. It killed the Princess of England on her way to get married. The Danse Macabre was a radical political statement. It reminded the poor that the rich were mortal too. This shifted the cultural memory. Cultural memory is how a society remembers its past. It's not history books. It's the stories and feelings passed down through generations. The cultural memory of the late 1300s became obsessed with vanity. Vanity, noun. Excessive pride in one's own appearance or achievements, or the quality of being worthless or futile. You will often hear the phrase, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." It means that earthly ambition is pointless because death is coming. In wealthy merchants' homes, people began to keep small statues on their desks. Half the face was beautiful, young, and healthy. The other half was a skull, eaten by worms. These objects are called memento mori, Latin for remember, you must die. Today, we might find this morbid or depressed, but for them, it was a way to focus. If life is short and death is random, you must focus on what matters now. And what mattered now began to change. We are moving from the emotional shock to the social consequence. The trauma inside the mind began to reshape the economy outside. Remember the biology. The population had crashed. Estimates vary, but perhaps 40% to 50% of the workforce was gone. Imagine a village that used to have 100 farmers working the Lord's land. Now, there are only 50. The wheat still needs to be harvested. The cows still need to be milked. The Lord needs the work done, or he will starve. For centuries, the Lord held all the power. He could tell the peasant, "Work for me or leave." And since there was nowhere to go, the peasant worked for pennies. But now, the peasant looks at the Lord. He looks at the empty fields. He realizes something new. You need me more than I need you. This is a turning point in history. This is the birth of leverage. Leverage. Power or ability to influence people or events. Advantage. The survivors woke up from their grief and realized they had leverage. They began to ask for higher wages. They demanded better food. They refused to work for the old feudal duties. The trauma had stripped away their fear of authority. If you have survived the apocalypse, you are not afraid of the local landlord. The ruling class panicked. They tried to pass laws to stop wages from rising. In England, the king passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351. It made it illegal to pay a peasant more than pre-plague rates. It made it illegal to refuse work. But you cannot legislate against supply and demand. And you cannot legislate against a man who has lost his fear. The friction between the traumatized but empowered survivors and the desperate elite was creating sparks. The psychological anger, the "why did God do this?" was shifting targets again. It was moving from the abstract, God, to the concrete, the government. The silence of the grave was replaced by the noise of the tavern. Men were talking. They were complaining. They were realizing that the system was rigged. The long shadow of the plague was about to ignite a fire. We are heading toward a collision. The grief is hardening into resolve. The tears are drying, and hands are reaching for weapons. The peasants' revolt is coming, and it starts with a tax collector who pushed a traumatized people one step too far. The date is May 30th, 1381. The place is a small, quiet village called Fobbing in Essex. A royal official rides in with a small group of soldiers. His name is John Bampton. He is here to collect a tax. But this is not just any tax. It is a poll tax. Poll tax. Noun. A fixed amount of tax levied on every adult, regardless of their income. This tax demanded the same amount of silver from a starving plowman as it did from a wealthy landowner. It was the third such tax in 4 years. Bampton sets up his table. He opens his ledger. He demands the villagers line up and pay. In a pre-plague world, they would have paid. They would have grumbled, looked at their shoes, and paid. Fear would have kept them silent. But this is the post-plague generation. These are men and women who survived the great mortality. They have seen death up close. They have bargained with God. They are not afraid of a bureaucrat with a scroll. A villager named Thomas Baker stands up. He looks Bampton in the eye. He says, clearly and calmly, that they have already paid, and they will not pay a penny more. Bampton is shocked. He orders his soldiers to arrest Baker, and then the snap happens. The villagers don't run. They swarm. They pull the soldiers off their horses. They chase the tax collector out of the village, throwing stones, shouting not with fear, but with fury. This is the moment the long shadow turns into fire. This is the insurrection. Insurrection, noun. A violent uprising against an authority or government. The news spreads like a virus. Within days, the entire county of Essex is in revolt. Then Kent joins in. Thousands of peasants begin to march on London. They are not a disorganized rabble. They are armed with the longbows they practiced with on Sundays. They are led by a man named Wat Tyler, a charismatic, mysterious figure who embodies the new confidence of the survivor class. But the spiritual engine of this revolt is a priest named John Ball. John Ball had been preaching a radical message for years. He looked at the Danse Macabre, the idea that death makes everyone equal, and he took it a step further. He asked a question that shook the foundations of English society. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? To delve means to dig, like Adam in the garden. To span, spun, means to make thread, like Eve. He was saying, in the beginning, there were no lords, there were no kings. We are all the same flesh. This is the psychological concept of resentment. Resentment, noun. Bitter indignation at having been treated unfairly. Trauma often clears the vision. It strips away the social construct. The peasants realized that the hierarchy wasn't a divine law, it was just a system of control. And systems can be broken. As the rebels marched toward London, they didn't just burn records, they targeted the symbols of the trauma. They went after the lawyers. They went after the tax records. They wanted to erase the memory of their debt. This mirrors the biology of a healing wound. Sometimes a wound itches, it becomes irritated. The body wants to scratch it, to tear off the scab. Society was tearing off the scab. On June 13th, 1381, the rebels arrived at the gates of London. The great city, usually locked tight, did something impossible. The people inside opened the gate. The London poor identified with the rural poor. The social body was rejecting the head. The rebels poured across London Bridge. What followed was a release of 30 years of repressed emotion. They burned the Savoy Palace, the home of the most hated man in England, John of Gaunt. But notice the discipline. Wat Tyler ordered that no one was allowed to steal. If a man was caught stealing a silver cup, he was thrown into the fire with the cup. They wanted to show that they were not thieves. They were executing justice. They were reclaiming their dignity. This is a crucial vocabulary word. Vindication. Vindication, noun. Proof that someone or something is right, reasonable, or justified. They were seeking vindication for the suffering of the plague years. They felt the government had abandoned them in the dark times and now exploited them in the good times. The boy king, Richard II, was only 14 years old. He holed up in the Tower of London. He could see the fires burning from his window. He could hear the roar of the crowd. For a brief, terrifying moment, the English monarchy hung by a thread. The trauma of the masses had become stronger than the stone walls of the castle. But mobs are unstable. The energy of an insurrection burns hot and fast. It lacks the stamina of an institution. The king agreed to meet the rebels at a place called Smithfield. It was a cattle market. It was here that the psychological tide would turn again. Wat Tyler rode out to meet the king. He was confident, perhaps too confident. He shook the king's hand. He asked for a drink of water. He treated the king as an equal. The king's entourage was horrified. To them, this wasn't negotiation. It was blasphemy. A scuffle broke out. The mayor of London drew his dagger. In a flash of steel, Wat Tyler was struck down. He fell from his horse, bleeding into the dirt of the market. The rebel army, thousands strong, watched their leader fall. They drew their bows. They prepared to slaughter the king and his men. And then, the 14-year-old king did something extraordinary. He didn't run. He rode toward the angry mob. He shouted, "Sirs, would you shoot your king? I will be your captain. Follow me." It was a psychological gamble of the highest order. He appealed to their deep-seated instinct of loyalty. He confused their anger. The rebels hesitated. The bows lowered. In that hesitation, the revolution died. The king led them away. Promises were made, promises of freedom, promises to end the tax. But as soon as the rebels dispersed, as soon as they went back to their villages, the status quo snapped back into place. Status quo, noun phrase. The existing state of affairs, especially regarding social or political issues. The king revoked his promises. "Serfs you were, and serfs you are," he reportedly said. The leaders were hunted down and hanged. John Ball was executed. The fire was put out, but the ashes remained. The trauma hadn't been resolved. It had been suppressed again. And when you suppress trauma, it doesn't disappear. It turns inward. It becomes anxiety. It becomes a fixation on the only thing you can control, the self. The failure of the revolt pushed the English mind toward a new obsession. If we cannot change the world out there, we must change the world in here. We are moving from the politics of the street to the politics of the soul. We are moving toward the Reformation. The revolt was crushed. The bodies of the rebels were taken down from the gibbets. The king sat securely on his throne. But you cannot kill an idea with a sword. The long shadow of the plague had taught people a dangerous lesson. The church could not save them from the plague, and the government would not save them from poverty. So the individual was left alone, alone with their grief, alone with their God. This isolation birthed a new kind of vocabulary in English history. We start to see words that focus on the interior. Interior, noun/adjective. Inner character or nature happening inside the mind or soul. Before the plague, religion was a public spectacle. You went to Mass, you watched the priest, you went home. It was a group activity. After the plague, and after the failure of the revolt, people began to look for a private connection to the divine. If the priest might die tomorrow, and the bishop is corrupt, I need a direct line to heaven. This movement was called Lollardy. The Lollards were followers of a theologian named John Wycliffe. They were the spiritual cousins of the rebels. They believed that the Bible should be in English, not Latin. They believed that a common man could understand God without a translator. Think about the psychological shift here. In the Middle Ages, Latin was the code of power. If you couldn't read Latin, you were locked out of the truth. You had to trust the expert. But trauma destroys trust. The survivors wanted to read the contract for themselves. They wanted to see the words of Christ in their own language. This is the concept of agency. Agency, action or intervention producing a particular effect, the capacity of individuals to act independently and make their own free choices. The survivors were claiming spiritual agency. Wycliffe's followers began translating the Bible. They met in secret, in basements and back rooms. They read aloud to each other. Imagine a candlelit room in Leicester or London in the 1390s. A group of weavers and merchants are huddled together. One of them is reading from a hand-copied book. They are reading the Beatitudes. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. For a generation defined by mourning, these words in their own tongue were electric. They didn't just hear the sound, they felt the meaning. The English language itself began to change. It became heavier, more serious. It started to absorb the weight of these complex theological ideas. We see this in the literature of the time. The poet Geoffrey Chaucer was writing the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer lived through the plague. He saw the world break. And in his writing, we see a new kind of realism. He doesn't just write about heroes. He writes about the miller, the cook, the wife of Bath. He writes about hypocrisy. Hypocrisy, noun. The practice of claiming to have moral standards or beliefs to which one's own behavior does not conform. Chaucer uses humor to expose the cracks in the system. He shows us the pardoner, a church official who sells forgiveness for money. The pardoner is a scam artist, selling pig bones as saints' relics. The audience laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. It was the laugh of recognition. They knew this man. They had seen him in their own towns, profiting from their fear of death. This satire is a coping mechanism. When you laugh at the thing that scares you, you take away its power. But while the poets laughed, the anxiety remained. The obsession with death didn't leave. It just became more sophisticated. We see the rise of the chantry. Chantry, noun. An endowment founded for priests to celebrate masses for the soul of the founder. Rich survivors, terrified of the suddenness of plague death, invested heavily in spiritual insurance. They built private chapels. They paid priests to sing for their souls. Forever. Forever. That was the key word. They wanted permanence in a world that had proven to be temporary. The architecture of the late Middle Ages reflects this. Look at the perpendicular style of English Gothic churches from this period. Huge windows, thin walls, soaring vertical lines. They were building cages of light to hold back the darkness. But the darkness was also changing the family unit. Historians have noticed a shift in the nuclear family after the Black Death. Because so many extended family members died, the core family, mom, dad, children, became tighter. The emotional bond between parents and children intensified. We see more toys in the archaeological record. We see more tender letters. It is as if the scarcity of life made life more precious. This brings us to a beautiful English phrase, cherished memory. Cherish, verb. To protect and care for someone lovingly, to hold something dear. People began to cherish their private lives more because the public world was so chaotic. But this privacy bred a new kind of fear, the fear of the other. If my home is my castle, and my family is my treasure, I must protect it from outsiders. The cosmopolitan openness of the early Middle Ages, where scholars traveled freely from Oxford to Paris to Bologna, began to freeze. Borders hardened. Languages became distinct. England started to feel more English. France felt more French. The shared trauma didn't unite Europe. It fragmented it, and in this fragmentation, the English language began to flex its muscle. It was no longer a dialect of peasants. It was becoming the language of the law, the language of the king, and the language of God. The trauma had cleared the throat of the nation, but before English could truly sing, it had to go through one more fire. The fire of civil war. The nobility, bored and broke because of the labor shortages, turned on each other. They started a war that would bleed England for 30 years. The Wars of the Roses. This was the final aftershock of the plague's economic disruption. The long shadow was about to pick up a sword again. The year is 1455. The plague is not gone. It returns every 10 or 20 years like a seasonal storm. But the acute terror has become a dull ache. Now a new terror arrives. The English nobility are restless. Their incomes have collapsed because there are fewer peasants to pay rent. Their leverage is gone. So, like desperate gamblers, they try to win money the old-fashioned way, by stealing it from each other. This is the War of the Roses. To an outsider, it looks like a Game of Thrones. Two rival families, York and Lancaster, fighting for the crown. But to the common people, the descendants of the plague survivors, it was chaos. Imagine living in a village. You survived the great mortality. You survived the poll tax. Now a lord rides up and demands you fight for the white rose. Next week, another lord demands you fight for the red rose. If you choose wrong, you lose your head. If you choose right, you might still lose your farm. This era introduces the vocabulary of instability. Instability. Noun. The state of being likely to change or fail. Lack of reliability. The psychological impact of this civil war was different from the plague. The plague was an act of God. The war was an act of man. It bred cynicism. Cynicism. Noun. An inclination to believe that people are motivated purely by self-interest. Skepticism. The English people watched their leaders betray each other with breathtaking speed. Kings were crowned, deposed, and murdered within months. This constant betrayal eroded faith in the divine right of kings. If God appoints the king, why does the king keep getting murdered in a basement? The long shadow of trauma was teaching the English people to be pragmatic, to be survivors. We see this survival instinct in the Pastons. The Pastons were a family of Norfolk gentry who wrote hundreds of letters to each other during this period. These letters are a treasure trove for historians. They don't write about glory. They don't write about honor. They write about defending their castle with crossbows because a rival lord is trying to steal it. One letter from Margaret Paston to her husband reads, "Right worshipful husband, I recommend me to you. Please you to know that I sent you a letter by my son. She is managing a siege while her husband is away in London. She is calm. She is capable. This is the resilience of the survivor class. Resilience, noun. The capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, toughness. Margaret Paston is not the weeping damsel of medieval romance. She is a manager. She is tough as nails. The trauma of the century has forged a new kind of woman, one who holds the keys and defends the gate. This resilience was mirrored in the language. English was becoming more direct, more functional. The flowery poetry of the court was being replaced by the sharp, legalistic prose of business. And business was booming. Here is the paradox of the post-plague world. While the nobles were killing each other, the common people were getting richer. With fewer people, there was more land to go around. A peasant who used to own one strip of land now owned 3. He ate meat every day, not just on feast days. He wore wool that used to be reserved for the rich. This is the golden age of the laborer. The trauma of the depopulation had an unintended side effect: prosperity for the survivors. This prosperity created a new class, the middle class. Neither peasant nor lord. These people had money, but they had no status, and they were hungry for knowledge. They were the perfect market for a new invention that was just arriving from Germany: the printing press. When William Caxton set up the first printing press in Westminster in 1476, he wasn't printing for the king. He was printing for the Pastons. He was printing for the merchants. He printed the Canterbury Tales. He printed histories. He printed manuals on how to play chess and how to die well. The connection between the trauma and the printing press is vital. The trauma created a need to know. It created a skepticism of oral authority. Don't tell me, show me the book. And the printing press satisfied that need. It also standardized the English language. Before print, people in the North could barely understand people in the South. Caxton had to choose one dialect to print in. He chose the London dialect. So, the language you are learning today, Standard English, was frozen in time by a businessman selling books to a traumatized, upwardly mobile population. The long shadow was beginning to lift, or rather, it was being illuminated by the lamp of literacy. But just as the Civil War ended and the Tudors took the throne in 1485, the old trauma of the spirit returned. The new king, Henry VII, brought peace, but his son, Henry VIII, would bring a different kind of violence. The English people had learned to survive the death of the body, plague, and the death of the state, civil war. Now, they would have to survive the death of their religion. The Reformation was coming, and it would rip the scars open all over again. The ghosts of the plague, the guilt, the fear of God's wrath, were not gone. They were just waiting for a new theology to inhabit. The year is 1538. The setting is a small parish church in the English countryside. For centuries, this building has been the color of a jewel box. The windows are red and blue stained glass. The walls are covered in paintings of saints. The statue of the Virgin Mary stands by the altar, wearing a real velvet dress donated by a local widow. Then the doors burst open. Men enter carrying hammers and pots of white lime. They are not invaders from a foreign land. They are neighbors. They are following the king's orders. They smash the stained glass. They pull the statue of Mary down and chop her into firewood. They take thick brushes and paint over the murals. The dancing skeletons, the saints, the angels, all covered in a stark, blinding white wash. This is iconoclasm. Iconoclasm. Noun. The action of attacking or assertively rejecting cherished beliefs and institutions, or established values and practices. Literally, image breaking. The Reformation has arrived, and for the collective psyche of England, this was a trauma that rivaled the plague itself. Why? Because it dismantled the spiritual technology people used to handle grief. Remember the chantries? Those private chapels where priests prayed for the souls of the dead? The new Protestant government declared them illegal. They said purgatory was a fiction. They said the prayers of the living could not help the dead. Stop and feel the weight of that. You are a survivor. You watched your father die of the sweating sickness. You paid your life savings to a priest to pray for his soul, believing that this would shorten his time in the fires of purgatory. You found comfort in that. It was your way of still caring for him. Now the king says, "That was a lie. Your money was wasted. Your father is on his own." This created a massive crisis of closure. Closure. Noun. A sense of resolution or conclusion at the end of a difficult experience. Without the rituals of the old church, the English people were denied closure. They were told to stop mourning and trust in faith alone. But grief doesn't listen to theology. When you take away the rituals of death, the dead don't disappear. They become ghosts. It is no accident that the late 1500s, the Elizabethan era, became obsessed with ghosts. Hamlet opens with a ghost. The literature is haunted. The long shadow of the Middle Ages was trying to speak, but the new laws had gagged it. The destruction was not just spiritual, it was physical. Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries. In less than 5 years, 800 years of social infrastructure was wiped off the map. The monasteries were not just prayer factories. They were the hospitals. They were the retirement homes. They were the food banks. When the monks were kicked out, the poor were kicked out with them. Suddenly, the roads were filled with vagrants. Vagrant. Noun. A person without a settled home or regular work who wanders from place to place and lives by begging. The streets of London filled with the desperate, the sick, and the mad. The social body had cut out its own heart. This shift mirrors the biological concept of autoimmunity. Autoimmune. Adjective. Relating to disease caused by antibodies or lymphocytes produced against substances naturally present in the body. England was attacking itself. It was tearing down its own history to build a new future. The psychological result was a deep, pervasive anxiety. Anxiety. Noun. A feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. In the Catholic system, you knew the rules. Do good works, confess, go to Mass, get saved. In the new Protestant system, especially the Calvinist version gaining popularity, the rules were hidden. You were saved by God's grace alone. But how did you know if you had it? You didn't. You had to search your own soul constantly for signs. This turned the English mind inward again. It created a culture of introspection. Diaries became popular. People wrote down their sins, their fears, their dreams. They were looking for evidence of their own salvation. This intense self-analysis is the grandfather of modern psychology. We stopped looking at the altar for answers and started looking in the mirror. But amidst this anxiety, something unexpected bloomed. When you remove the visual art, the statues, the stained glass, the paintings, the human need for beauty doesn't die. It shifts channels. If we cannot paint with colors, we will paint with words. The English language exploded. Because the Bible was now in English, the air was filled with metaphors, rhythms, and ancient stories. The common people were soaking in high-level language every Sunday. This created the perfect soil for William Shakespeare. Shakespeare is the ultimate child of this trauma. He was born in 1564, just as the dust of the Reformation was settling. The plague still closed the theaters regularly. Death was still a constant neighbor. But Shakespeare didn't write just about death. He wrote about the interior life of the survivor. Think of Hamlet holding the skull of Yorick. Alas, poor Yorick! I knew him, Horatio. This is the memento mori of the Middle Ages, but upgraded. It's not just a scary skeleton anymore. It's a friend. It's a conversation. It's a meditation on memory. Shakespeare took the raw, screaming grief of the 1300s and refined it into melancholy. Melancholy, noun. A deep, pensive, and long-lasting sadness. Melancholy became fashionable. It became a sign of intelligence to be sad, to think deeply about mortality. The long shadow had softened. It was no longer a monster under the bed. It was a dark cloak you wore to look sophisticated. But the biology of the city was still dangerous. London in 1600 was a pressure cooker. The population had exploded. The sanitation was non-existent. The noise was deafening. And the rats were still there. The Great Plague of 1665 was looming on the horizon. The final act of the medieval trauma was about to play out. But before we get there, we must look at one final twist in the English psyche. The export of trauma. The English people, hardened by 3 centuries of death, religious war, and economic upheaval, began to look outward. They looked across the ocean. They were looking for a new world, a place to start over, a place without ghosts. But as we know, you carry your ghosts with you. The settlers who sailed for America were not blank slates. They were the traumatized children of the long shadow, and they brought their anxiety, their work ethic, and their fear of the other with them. The seed of the Middle Ages was about to be planted in new soil. The year is 1649. We are standing outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, London. It is a cold January day. A massive crowd has gathered. They are not cheering. They are holding their breath. On a wooden scaffold, a man kneels down. He is Charles I, the King of England. An axe falls. A low, guttural groan rises from the thousands of people watching. It is a sound described by witnesses as something they had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. This moment is regicide. Regicide, noun. The action of killing a king. Psychologically, this was the ultimate breaking of the medieval mind. In the Middle Ages, the king was God's deputy. You could not kill him without killing the world order. But the English people had done it. The trauma of the last 3 centuries, the death of the population, the death of the church, had led to the death of the monarchy. What followed was a decade of military rule under Oliver Cromwell. It was a grim, serious time. Christmas was banned. The theaters were closed. It was a national attempt at purification. But you cannot legislate trauma away. When the monarchy was finally restored in 1660, the people cheered. They wanted the Merry England back. They wanted the nightmare to be over. But nature had one final, cruel card to play. The long shadow was about to stretch out for its final, most devastating act. The year is 1665. The summer is hot. The air is stagnant. In the parish of St. Giles, a watchman paints a red cross on a door. Above it, he scrawls the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." The Black Death has returned. This is the Great Plague of 1665. It is the same bacterium as 1347, but the psychological reaction is different now. It is more bureaucratic. It is more organized. This gives us the word quarantine. Quarantine. Noun. A state, period, or place of isolation in which people or animals that have arrived from elsewhere or been exposed to infectious or contagious disease are placed. The word comes from the Italian quaranta, 40, the number of days ships used to have to wait. But in London, it meant being locked in your own house. If one person in your family was sick, the authorities padlocked the door from the outside. You were trapped with the dying. Imagine the horror of that. Healthy children locked in with a dying father. This policy created a profound sense of helplessness. Helplessness. Noun. Inability to defend oneself or to act effectively. Samuel Pepys, a naval administrator and famous diarist, walked through the streets. He wrote, "But now, how few people I see, and those walking like people that had taken leave of the world." London was a ghost town. The grass grew in the streets of the commercial district. The only sound was the bell of the dead cart. It felt like the 1300s all over again. The trauma loop was repeating. It seemed like England would never escape the grip of the Middle Ages. The rats were winning. But then, the accidental twist occurred. Sunday, September 2nd, 1666. A baker named Thomas Farriner on Pudding Lane forgets to put out his oven. The sparks fly. They land on a pile of dried brushwood. The fire jumps to the hay in the inn-yard next door. A strong wind is blowing from the east. London is built of wood, pitch, and straw. It is essentially a pile of kindling waiting for a match. By morning, the fire is a wall of flame moving through the city. This is the conflagration. Conflagration. Noun. An extensive fire that destroys a great deal of land or property. The fire raged for 4 days. It melted the lead roof of St. Paul's Cathedral. The lead ran down the streets like a river of silver lava. The stones exploded from the heat. Samuel Pepys watched from a boat on the Thames. He saw an arch of fire spanning the horizon. It looked like the end of the world. But strangely, it was the beginning of the future. Here is the biology mirroring society again. When a wound is infected, sometimes the only way to save the patient is to burn the wound, to sear the flesh. This is called cauterization. Cauterize. Verb. To burn the skin or flesh of a wound with a heated instrument or caustic substance, typically to stop bleeding or prevent the spread of infection. The Great Fire of London cauterized the city. It burned down the slums, it burned the rats, it burned the fleas, it burned the filth of the medieval alleys where the plague had lived for 300 years. When the smoke cleared, 80% of the city was gone. But the plague was gone too. It never returned to London in epidemic force again. The survivors stood in the ashes. They had lost their homes, their churches, their history. But they did not despair. The resilience we talked about earlier, the Paston resilience, the survivor resilience, kicked in immediately. They didn't just rebuild, they upgraded. Sir Christopher Wren and the King planned a new city. They wanted wide boulevards, they wanted stone and brick. No more wood, no more dark, narrow tunnels. This brings us to a crucial concept: tabula rasa. Tabula rasa, noun phrase. A clean slate, an absence of preconceived ideas or predetermined goals. The fire gave London a tabula rasa. Psychologically, this was the moment the Middle Ages truly ended in England. The physical environment that sustained the old world, the dark, cramped, mysterious labyrinth, was erased. In its place rose a rational, mathematical city. St. Paul's Cathedral was rebuilt with a giant dome, a symbol of logic and light, not the spooky vertical spikes of the Gothic style. The long shadow was finally being dispelled by the Enlightenment. The language changed too. In the years following the fire, English scientists founded the Royal Society. Their motto was nullius in verba. Take nobody's word for it. They demanded plain English. They wanted clear descriptions of facts. They rejected the metaphorical, flowery language of the past. They wanted language to be like the new brick houses, solid, fireproof, and functional. This is the birth of empiricism. Empiricism, noun. The theory that all knowledge is derived from sense experience, evidence, rather than from tradition or theory. The trauma had finally transformed into a thirst for facts. We are done with mysteries. We are done with invisible arrows from God. We want to understand how the world works so we can control it. But there was a cost to this new rationality. As the English mind became more scientific, it became less emotional. The wild grief of the medieval peasants was replaced by the stiff upper lip of the modern Englishman. The stiff upper lip is an idiom meaning to display fortitude and stoicism in the face of adversity, and to suppress the display of emotion. After 1666, crying in public became less acceptable. Panic was seen as a failure of reason. The English people had decided, we will not be victims of chaos again. We will impose order on the world. And where would they impose this order? Not just in London, but on the high seas, on the maps of the world. The energy that had been trapped inside the island, fighting the plague and the civil wars, was about to explode outward. The empire is coming, and it is built on the psychological foundation of trauma. Control the environment before it kills you. The smoke of 1666 has cleared. London is rising from the ashes in white stone. The plague pits are paved over. We have arrived at the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era. But, as we know, trauma doesn't just vanish. It echoes. Let's look at the legacy of these 300 years of suffering. Legacy, noun. something left or handed down by a predecessor. What is the legacy of the long shadow in the English-speaking world today? First, look at our obsession with hygiene. Hygiene, noun. Conditions or practices conducive to maintaining health and preventing disease, especially through cleanliness. The trauma of the Great Mortality wired a deep fear of dirt and bad air into the culture. The English, and later the Americans, became obsessed with sanitation, drains, and clean water. This wasn't just about health, it was about moral cleanliness. Cleanliness is next to godliness, as the saying goes. This is a direct response to the squalor of the plague years. Second, look at our relationship with work. Remember the golden age of the laborer? The moment when peasants realized their labor had value? This evolved into the Protestant work ethic. The idea is that hard work is a sign of salvation. If you are working hard and succeeding, God is smiling on you. If you are idle, you are opening the door to the devil and to poverty/death. This anxiety about wasting time is a ghost of the survivor's guilt. Why am I alive? I must make it count. Third, consider the English sense of humor. English humor is often dark, dry, and self-deprecating. It is gallows humor. Gallows humor, noun phrase. Grim and ironic humor in a desperate or hopeless situation. When it rains at a picnic, an English person says, "Lovely weather for ducks." When a situation is catastrophic, they say, "It could be worse." This is a defense mechanism forged in the fires of the 14th century. If you can joke about the disaster hasn't beaten you. Fourth, look at the concept of privacy. The English home is a fortress. An Englishman's home is his castle. This desire for walls, for fences, for keeping the world at a distance, is a scar from the time when the outside meant death. The collective trauma shattered the communal living of the early Middle Ages and created the private individual. And finally, the language itself. The English you are learning is a survivor's tongue. It is a hybrid. It has the earthy, physical words of the Germanic peasants: flesh, bone, earth, work, love. It has the legal, precise words of the French ruling class: justice, sovereign, merchant, money. It has the intellectual, abstract words of the Latin Church: salvation, redemption, spirit. The trauma mashed these languages together. It forced them to talk to each other. When the peasants revolted, they shouted in English. When the lawyers wrote the peace treaties, they wrote in English. When Shakespeare wrote about the human soul, he used all of it. So, when you speak English, you are not just using a tool for communication. You are activating a history of survival. You are using words that were shouted on the docks of Messina. Words that were whispered in the secret Bible readings of the Lollards. Words that were printed in the shadow of the Tower of London. You are speaking the language of people who looked into the abyss and decided to build a bridge over it. This brings us to the final psychological concept: post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth. Noun phrase. Positive psychological change experienced as a result of adversity and other challenges in order to rise to a higher level of functioning. The Europe that emerged from the long shadow was stronger, richer, and more dynamic than the Europe that went into it. The pressure of the population collapse forced innovation. It forced labor-saving devices like the printing press and better mills. It forced new medical ideas. It forced a new relationship with God. It broke the chains of feudalism. It was a horrific price to pay. Millions of lives, centuries of fear. But the after was radically different from the before. As we close this journey, we must ask ourselves, are we in a long shadow today? We too have lived through pandemics. We too feel the anxiety of a changing climate and shifting global powers. We too sometimes feel like the systems are broken. The history of the Middle Ages teaches us that this feeling is not the end. It is the middle. It is the painful, messy, terrifying process of metamorphosis. Metamorphosis. Noun. The process of transformation from an immature form to an adult form. The caterpillar dissolves completely before it becomes a butterfly. For a while, it is just a soup of cells. It looks like death, but it is actually reorganization. The Middle Ages was the soup. The modern world is the butterfly. And now, as we stand on the edge of the next great change, AI, biotechnology, space travel, we can look back at those ancestors and nod. We know how they felt, and we know that they made it. We began this journey on the docks of Messina, staring at 12 ghost ships. We watched the rats run down the ropes. We watched the fires burn in London. We watched the statues fall and the kings die. Now, take a moment to look out of your own window. The world you see, the hospitals, the clean streets, the churches, the government buildings, is built on top of that graveyard. But the most important monument to that time isn't made of stone. It is the language we are speaking right now. English is a museum of trauma. Every time you use a word like quarantine, you are touching the fear of 1665. Every time you say cherish, you are echoing the survivors who learned to hold their children tighter. Every time you use gallows humor, you are using the shield forged by peasants who had nothing left but a joke. To learn English is not just to memorize grammar. It is to inherit this history. You are stepping into a stream of endurance. Endurance, noun. The fact or power of enduring an unpleasant or difficult process or situation without giving way. The people of the Middle Ages endured things that would break the modern mind. And yet, they didn't just survive. They wrote poetry. They composed music. They built cathedrals that touched the clouds. They proved that the human spirit is indomitable. Indomitable, adjective. Impossible to subdue or defeat. This is the final lesson of the long shadow. Trauma changes us, yes. It leaves scars. It makes us anxious. It makes us cynical. But it also makes us deep. It gives us perspective. Perspective, noun. A particular attitude toward or way of regarding something. A point of view. When you study history, you gain perspective. You realize that your current problems, while real, are part of a long human story of overcoming the odds. You realize that you are not alone in your anxiety. You are standing in a line that stretches back to Thomas Baker in Fobbing, to Margaret Paston in her castle, to the poet Chaucer. They are your ancestors in spirit. And now you have the vocabulary to understand them. We have explored the grief, the fear, the guilt, and the rage. We have seen how biology mirrors society. We have seen how the accidental twist of a flea bite rewired the brain of a continent. The long shadow has finally lifted. But the light it left behind is the modern world. Thank you for walking through the dark with me. Keep listening, keep reading, and remember, the words you speak are the survivors of history. Treat them with respect. This is the London Gritty Chronicles.